The Bible says children obey your parents, but a state delegate in Virginia intends to introduce legislation that would require parents to obey their children when it comes to their so-called gender identity. The proposed legislation would make it a crime for parents to not affirm their child's gender identity. It would expand the definition of child abuse to potentially make this a felony. Here's Virginia Delegate Elizabeth Guzman discussing her proposal with reporter Nick Minnick.
What could the penalties be if, the investigation concludes and it's concluded that a parent is not affirming of their LGBTQ child? What could the consequences be?
Well, we first have to have an investigation. It could be a felony, it could be a misdemeanor, but we know that a CPS charge could harm, your employment, could harm your education.
Is this what the future looks like in Virginia? Joining me now to discuss this is Will Estrada, president of the Virginia-based Parental Rights Foundation. He also previously served in the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Will, welcome to Washington Watch.
Joseph, thank you so much for having me on.
We're glad to have you. Now, let's be clear. The legislation has not yet been introduced, but clearly she's serious about it. Where did this idea come from?
So, Joseph, this idea actually came a few years ago. Delegate Guzman actually introduced this bill. It was House Bill 580 on January 8th, 2020. So a couple legislative sessions ago. The interesting thing, Joseph, is that this bill was introduced when the Democrats controlled the Virginia House of Delegates. And it was quietly, Democrats joined with the Republicans, quietly tabled. So even in the previous administration, this was before Glenn Youngkin was elected, there was no appetite in Virginia to adopt this. But I want to read for you, Joseph, what exactly this proposed bill, which I think she's saying she's going to reintroduce in this upcoming 2023 legislative session here in Virginia. Here's what it says, because she's attempting to walk back what she said. So it would amend Virginia Code of dealing with abuse and neglect, which says abused or neglected child means any child less than 18 years of age. And under her proposed language, here's what it would do: whose parent or other person responsible for his care creates or inflicts, threatens to create or inflict, or allows to be created or inflicted upon such child a physical or mental injury on the basis of the child's gender identity or sexual orientation. So here's the question for Delegate Guzman. What is a mental injury on the basis of the child's gender identity or sexual orientation?
Will, I'll say this somewhat sarcastically, but I'm also serious. Would this create a legal obligation for a parent to obey their child?
This would create so many unintended consequences that I don't think we know what it would do. It would require every mandatory reporter, a doctor, a nurse, a teacher, to report someone if they suspect that they are abusing or neglecting a child by creating a mental injury on the basis of the child's gender or sexual orientation. And Joseph, here's what's deeply, deeply troubling to me. Delegate Guzman is a social worker, and she should know the danger of runaway investigations into just someone making an anonymous report of a child. There was this really great law review article. It's a little dated. It came out in 2005. It was by Doreen Coleman. She is a professor of law at Duke University School of Law. She wrote the article. You can just Google it. It's called Storming the Castle to Save the Children: The Ironic Costs of a Child Welfare Exception to the Fourth Amendment. It was published in William and Mary Law Review back in 2005. And what she said was the majority of intrusions on family privacy do not directly benefit the children involved, and in many instances actually cause them demonstrable harm. This is going to create just a vast amount of children who are being reported for mental harm, again, however that is defined. And what's going to happen is children who are truly victims of abuse, they are going to fall through the cracks because of this just hijacking of the CPS system in Virginia if this bill were to become law.
And you talk about the term emotional harm, right? Or mental harm, whatever that is, that's in the bill that would criminalize emotional harm. In theory, a parent refusing to use so-called preferred pronouns could simply be enough emotional harm, because that's a very subjective concept, to not just get the CPS involved, but to potentially result in criminal penalties. And that's a step that they haven't taken in other contexts. We've seen parents lose custody over children around this issue, but the idea of prosecuting a parent because they do not accept what their child is saying about themselves would be a brave new world indeed. Now, Will, you mentioned the fact that this was introduced in a previous administration when the Democrats had control of Virginia. We also know that Glenn Youngkin got elected largely on a parental rights platform. Is there a stomach for something like this in Virginia?
The good news for the people who are listening is that this bill is dead on arrival. It couldn't pass when the Democrats had the House of Delegates in the Commonwealth of Virginia. It certainly, Ralph Northam was the governor, with Glenn Youngkin there, with Winsome Sears, with Attorney General Miyares, with the Republicans having the majority in the House of Delegates. This bill is dead on arrival. But it's deeply concerning to me that a social worker is even considering reintroducing this bill. Joseph, we have seen at Parental Rights Foundation the harm that children face in these investigations. Here's what happens when a CPS investigation happens. A government official comes to the door and they say, you need to let me in so I can interview your children. And if you don't, I may need to go down to the local court to get an order to remove your children. It's terrifying to a family. It threatens their Fourth Amendment rights. It threatens harm to children. And it's deeply disturbing that Delegate Guzman would introduce or even consider introducing this bill.
Well, Delegate Guzman was asked by a local news station what she would say to those who say this is criminalizing parenting. And she said, quote, it's educating parents because the law tells you the do's and don'ts. So this law is telling you do not abuse your children because they are LGBTQ, end quote. What's your response to that?
Joseph, abuse is a crime. It's already a crime. Does not need to be changed. The concern here, and that's why I read this change of what her bill that was previously introduced would do, by putting in the words or mental injury. It allows a social worker to go on a fishing expedition to find a judge who might not like the decisions that a parent makes and to potentially rip apart a family. Now, if the bill had just said you can't physically abuse your child on the basis of the child's gender identity or sexual orientation, I don't think anyone would have any concern with that. You never commit harm to a child, no matter what goes on. The problem is that mental injury. We know where this is going. It's if the government doesn't like the parenting decisions or even what a parent tells their child, then she's threatening, we will come in as the government and rip apart your family. And that should be troubling to every single
Estrada,
American in this country.
Thank you. It is troubling. We appreciate your time. Thanks so much.